Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer here with DailyRoto. This weekend I'll be competing in DraftKings Fantasy Baseball Championship live from Denver, Colorado. I won't be actually in Denver, Colorado. I'm sending one of the DailyRoto members, James McCool, Paydirt DFS, a local out there, to sit in on my behalf. But I thought this was a good opportunity for me to do a little bit of a lineup breakdown on my qualifier journey, my thoughts on the qualifying process, and perhaps ways to think about qualifiers in the future, because they're a very unique brand of tournament in DFS. So let's start with talking about qualifiers. Qualifiers are a very unique type of GPP because you need to win them or finish in the top 2 or 3, depending on where you're qualifying at in the season, to ascend to a next GPP. And then to get the value that you accrued by winning that first GPP, you actually have to do quite well in that second GPP. So as an example, the package is worth $37,500. That's if you qualify. If you look at the pay scale in terms of what you have to get to exceed that $37,500 value of the trip that you won with your first GPP, you're talking about having to finish in the top 10 to 15 spots, maybe top 25-ish out of 125 entrants. So you're having to finish in the top 5th of the field, much closer to the top, 10% of the field to really make money in these qualifiers. Now, they're coveted for a reason. These experiences are incredible. The sites do a great job. I've attended live finals on former sites like Star Street and Draft Street, current sites FanDuel and DraftKings, and all these sites do an excellent job at putting on tremendous events. You get great food, you get the ability to have open bars and free drinks, you get excursions. In this particular one, the contestants are going to get the opportunity to take batting practice at Coors Field and take a tour of Coors Field and the dugouts and the batting cages and all that stuff. It's great. It's an awesome experience. You also get to interact with a lot of fellow DFSers, which is a really coveted experience because DFS is a really lonely experience. You're often, grinding long hours, looking at data by yourself and making lineups by yourself, and then you might not have friends who play DFS or get to talk about it. So getting to meet with like-minded individuals is a really coveted experience. Some of my best friends in the industry, some of my best friends overall, I've met at these live finals and had the benefit of developing long-lasting friendships from these. So they're very coveted experiences, but they're also a very challenging drain on the bankroll that you have to be careful about how you approach them. So for me, my personal approach, I have gone the approach of trying to max out qualifiers and try to get as many seats as possible and invest as much money as possible into getting those seats. And for me, that has been a losing proposition in the past. So now what I try to do is I'm trying to be much more selective about the times and the shots that I take at these live finals. So if you notice, if you look at the contenders list, you would have to scroll very far down to find my name on the qualifier sheet. And that's because I was one of the very last people to actually earn a seat. And that was intended. I wasn't taking a lot of shots at this live final this year. I was waiting until some of the other contestants, some of the other great players that were trying to max out 5 entries, had actually maxed them out. That removes them from the field, makes the competition a little bit softer to compete against. I also like waiting till the end of the year when they offer some qualifiers where they have multiple seats available. And by waiting, this controls my investment in terms of how I'm trying to attack the qualifiers. And then I set aside a specific dollar amount that I'm trying to attack with the qualifiers. So for this one, I set aside a few $1,000s that I was going to take shots at the end. I ended up only taking one big shot at this one of this final qualifiers when I finally felt I had a team that made sense for a qualifier. So that's the other thing I try to do. I try to make sure I'm putting together a roster that isn't just contending to cash in a GPP, but is contending to win. So I'm waiting for an opportunity where I have a lineup that I feel very strongly about, that I know is going to be contrarian in spots, that I feel like I can separate myself from the field. So let's take a look at that first set of qualifying that I had to go through. It ended up being 2 sets because I tied here with Empire Maker with 152.7 points. Different lineups, different approaches, but we ended up on the same final score. This lineup for me, this slate was an interesting one. It was one with lots of offense. You had Texas at home against the White Sox. You had Colorado at home playing Milwaukee. 2 good offenses in Coors Field there. You also had the Dodgers on the road against Jordan Zimmerman in a really good spot. 9 guaranteed innings for the Dodgers offense, fully healthy against a bad starter and a bad bullpen. there were spots I knew teams were going to be chalky. And I did incorporate some chalk on this team. You can see, first off, at the starting pitcher spot, I used Corey Kluber and Matt Moore. Now, this was originally Max Scherzer. This was the night that Max Scherzer got scratched, and I had to late swap to Corey Kluber. I ended up having to change my lineup around after that. And it got a little bit more chalky in the hitting side when I had to change my lineup around after that because I had a little bit more room to spend. But I knew the pitching side, there wasn't a contrarian play for me on this slate. It was very clear. It was Scherzer and Matt Moore. Matt Moore was super cheap on this slate at home against the Phillies, just $5,000. Phillies are one of the worst offenses in baseball. That's one of the best pitching environments in baseball. And that price, with all that extreme hitting on this slate, was too hard to pass up. So I really didn't care that Matt Moore was going to be heavily owned. He was simply too cheap. And Max Scherzer against the Padres in San Diego was going to be my way of fitting in Max Scherzer and the offense that I want. The area that I thought I was going to be contrarian on this slate, and I had a pretty good feeling that I would be, was the Angels on the road in Baltimore. A really big park upgrade for the Angels, specifically for power and home runs. And when you think of the Angels, you might not think of them as a power-laden team because they play in this big ballpark that suppresses home runs. But you move them into Camden Yards, one of the best parks in all of baseball, for home runs, and all of a sudden their team is loaded with guys who, would project if they played all their games in Camden Yards for 25 plus home runs. Guys like Cole Calhoun and Mike Trout and Albert Pujols and Luis Valbuena. They're a good offensive upside team. In addition, on this slate, there was a late scratch in the starting pitcher that pushed them to Jeremy Hellickson, who was one of the weakest starters, in baseball, had struggled in the NL during the course of the season and was now having to pitch in the AL in a small ballpark. I knew because Texas was at home against the White Sox, because Coors Field was in play, because the Dodgers were in a really good spot, that the Angels, who had an implied total about a half run lower than everybody else on the slate, were going to be low owned. The other thing that I saw was that they were cheap. And that was what was really interesting to me. You looked at Pujols, he was $3,600 at a loaded first base position. Caleb Cowherd, an interesting punt play because he was $2,200 at second base, which was a relatively thin position. Cole Calhoun, who I had mentioned before, $3,500. And then Mike Trout, of course. Mike Trout's always going to garner ownership. He's always going to be expensive. He's the best player in baseball, $5,400. But 18% I can deal with when the other parts of this stack, were sub 8%. And for me, the other thing that was interesting here was combined, I got the 9 hitter in Cowherd, the first place hitter in Calhoun, then Trout and Pujols, a 9-1-2-3 stack. And I got this for a combined, $14,000 for 4 hitters. So pretty cheap. That allowed me to then take shots with Coors Field. Now, my original construction on this was a 4-3-1. Asdrubal Cabrera was my punt shortstop. It was between him and Brandon Crawford. Crawford was $2,400. Crawford, who Empire Maker played, ended up being about the same ownership and had a much bigger day, hit a home run. If I knew the ownership would have been the same between Crawford and Cabrera, I thought Crawford would be higher owned. I would have preferred Crawford in that spot, but I had Cabrera. I thought he'd be a little bit lower owned because he was a little bit more expensive at $2,900. Facing Justin Nicolino, it was a pretty good matchup that I was comfortable with. But the thing that led me to so the construction was a 4-3-1. It was 4 Angels and then 3 Rockies, but I did not have Charlie Blackmon, who I knew would be popular. Charlie Blackmon, like Mike Trout, is always going to be popular, but was very expensive. I had Nolan Arenado, who at third base, only one position you can fill, and he was super expensive. I thought that would hold his ownership in check. I had Jonathan Lucroy originally before the Scherzer scratch, and I had Carlos Gonzalez. So I was working down the order a little bit more, which I thought would be unique because I thought the Rockies stacks would largely have Blackmon. Now, when Scherzer was scratched, that opened up enough money that if I could move down to Kluber, that got me $700, and then I needed a little bit more to get up to Blackmon. The other thing that happened when Scherzer got scratched is the Nationals started a left-handed relief pitcher in Matt Grace, and that opened up an opportunity for me with Austin Hedges, who's just $2,700, has historically hit left-handed pitching pretty well. I didn't know if they were going to shift him up in the lineup or not while I was making the swaps. I was hopeful that they did. They ended up not. But I thought this guy is not going to be owned at all because nobody's going to have used him against Max Scherzer. he's not facing Max Scherzer anymore. Now he's facing a weaker left-handed pitcher in a bullpen game. So I knew I'd get him at super low ownership, and that could afford me to get Blackmon, whose high ownership wasn't really a problem. The other thing I had working in my favor of being able to swap to Blackmon here is the Angels had gotten off to a good start. I had a couple home runs already in the bank from a relatively low-owned stack. So it didn't hurt to get more chalky with the Charlie Blackmon play. All of these swaps I made when the news came out that Scherzer was scratched, which happened like right at 8 o'clock, and Kluber's game locked at 8:10 or something like that. So I swapped to Kluber everywhere I had Scherzer, and then I just started making individual pivots. So that's how I ended up on the lineup. The theme here was one cheap contrarian stack that I knew had the advantage of getting a big ballpark upgrade, had the power to pay off that even if they don't score a ton of runs or the most runs on the slate, their runs are probably coming from home runs. And then also on this particular slate, I knew they'd be low owned, and they're on the road, guaranteed ninth inning as well. So the Angels fit all those buckets. I was going to be contrarian with them. I knew I could be chalky at the pitcher spot because I really didn't see any contrarian pivots to make there. It's only a 104-person field where you had to finish in the top two. It was a $900 entry. So this was me taking my shot. Now I ended up tying with Empire Maker. There's a little bit of run good and a little bit of run bad in this tie. Crawford in the ninth inning got up again. The lineup turned over one more time, and he hit a bomb to center field with Sandoval on first. It ended up being a double. I was ahead by 7 points. If Sandoval scores there, I then am tied with Crawford on second. Thankfully, Pablo is not the swiftest of foot. He ended up stopping at third, but later on that inning, they made an error that allowed Brandon Crawford to score. We ended up tied. The rule is you play a tiebreaker and a head-to-head. So the next night, we played a head-to-head game. This was the end result of it. For this lineup, for me, this was just a cash game lineup. And this was the line. I played two cash game lineups that night. This was the one that I thought had the higher upside of the two. And this was an interesting night because Empire is one of the sharpest players in all of DFS, and I thought our decisions were really, really tight. If you actually look at how many players we had different, we only had 5 players different, but the pricing differences weren't super big. Like I took a punt at second base, he took a punt in the outfield. That allowed me to get Mike Trout. He spent a little bit more on Neil Walker in Coors Field, and he spent a little bit more on top-end pitching with Chris Sale at 14-1, but then went low with Rafael Montero at 5-7 for a combined 19-8. I took Steven Strasburg as first start off the DL. I wasn't worried about pitch count. It was, again, that matchup with San Diego that I was trying to attack. Strasburg ended up pitching pretty well. 91 pitches, so maybe was a little bit limited. Maybe I ran a little bit good that he was efficient there. And then I took a mid-tier approach with Colin McHugh. So my combined starters were at 19.3. His were at 19.8. I gained a little bit of salary there, and we ended up getting about the same performance. Chris Sale struggled a little bit with the Yankees, didn't have one of his usual great games. Rafael Montero pitched very well. McHugh pitched pretty good, and Strasburg pitched pretty well. So we were about even there. The big difference, and this is just one of those, it comes down to a 3 versus 3 hitting side where we're almost equal on points. I get Mike Trout in the game where Mike Trout hits 2 home runs. His big bat, his big spend, Neil Walker here in Coors Field only ended up with 7 points. And really that was the big difference. We both took punt, middle infield options. I took Tyler Saladino, who was hitting second in Texas against, I believe it was Martin Perez that night. He took Tim Anderson, the leadoff hitter, a little bit more expensive there, so he spent a little bit more on the punt. I punted again with shortstop with Brandon Crawford to a forward Trout. He punted in the outfield instead. So he spent a little bit more on shortstop and second base. I spent a little bit more on the outfield and ended up going on my favor. The guys we matched on this slate, Mike Napoli in Texas against a lefty and Derek Holland. He was one of the cheaper first base options at 3,800. Didn't matter that he was hitting 6th when the team had an implied total near 7. Eric Thames, the leadoff hitter for Milwaukee on the road in Colorado, 4,600, a very attractive price tag. Very difficult fade there. Hernan Perez from Milwaukee, 3,500. He was the 5th place hitter. And Stephen Vogt from Milwaukee, 3,300, the 6th place hitter. Getting 2 hitters in the middle of the lineup, even if they're a little bit lower, with Hernan Perez and Stephen Vogt for a combined 6,800 in Coors Field was kind of a no-brainer. If there's one critique I could give, I was a little bit surprised that Empire Maker didn't swap off of some of these guys after Trout got me off to such a big lead. But it's a tough swap to make to get off really, really chalky good plays like Eric Thames. I thought maybe there was an opportunity with Vogt with other catchers around him, but it came down to basically a 3 versus 3 on the hitting side, and I had Mike Trout, who had a Mike Trout game. So I was fortunate enough to come out ahead on this one. That earned me the seat, and I will be competing this Saturday. We'll have some coverage, hopefully, from James McCool, who we've basically tagged out there with, hey, get as much video as you can, whether it's Periscope, whether it's on Twitter, and try to represent DailyRoto and give people a little bit of a look inside what the experience is. I won't be able to be out there live. I will be celebrating a 90th birthday with a grandparent and lots of family this weekend, so I'm looking forward to that. But I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to walk through a little bit of my thought process and how I approach a head-to-head game versus how I approach a tournament lineup, and specifically qualifiers on the whole. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys out there. Hopefully you guys will find a little bit of interest in the lineup reviews, but also following along in the sweat this weekend, where I try to take home the first prize and $500,000 on the DraftKings Live Final. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.